In a dimly lit vault beneath the British Museum, there sits a jade tablet carved by hands that turned to dust 3,000 years ago. The artisan who created it never saw the ocean that separated his homeland from distant shores, never knew that across impossible distances, other hands were carving the same impossible creature into stone and wood and clay. On this Chinese scroll, a serpentine form coils through clouds, scales rendered with such precision that you can almost hear them rasp against each other. The creature's talons grip the air itself. Its eyes hold an intelligence that no artist should have been able to imagine without having seen something real. 7,000 miles away, in the frozen reaches of Scandinavia, Viking craftsmen etched their own version into the prow of a longship. Same elongated body, same reptilian features, same terrible majesty. They called it by a different name, told different stories about its origins, but the fundamental form remained unchanged. The serpent, the winged lizard, Nile-Oda, the fire breather, travels south to the jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula, where Mayan stoneworkers left their mark on temple walls that would stand long after their civilization crumbled into mystery. There, coiling around glyphs that scholars still struggle to fully decipher, the same creature emerges from the rock. Feathered serpent, they called it, Kukulkan.a, a god that descended from the sky with wings that blotted out the sun. In the red desert of the Australian outback, Aboriginal artists painted their dreamtime stories onto rock faces under stars that witnessed 40,000 years of human memory. And there, among the handprints and hunting scenes and creation myths, you find it again. The rainbow serpent, they called it. A being of immense power that shaped the very land itself, that flew through the sky and burrowed through the earth, that commanded both fear and reverence. These cultures never traded stories. They never exchanged letters, or myths, or artistic techniques. The mathematical probability of them independently inventing the same legendary creature, with the same essential characteristics, stretches coincidence beyond its breaking point. Yet there it is, appearing in every corner of the inhabited world. Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, Australia. Everywhere humans settled, they carved dragons. The word itself shifts across languages and centuries. Drake, draken, long wand, naga, wyvern, wyworm, o. But beneath the linguistic variations, the archetype remains constant. A massive reptile, often serpentine, frequently capable of flight, usually breathing fire or poison, always representing power beyond human comprehension. Our ancestors, separated by oceans and millennia, describe the same nightmare made flesh. This is not how mythology typically works. Cultures create unique monsters from their unique fears and environments. Yet with dragons, we see something different. Something that suggests a shared origin point. A common source. What were our ancestors trying to tell us? What memory, passed down through countless generations, embedded itself so deeply in the human psyche that it emerged independently across every civilization? Were they describing dinosaurs, somehow glimpsed through fossil remains and reconstructed by minds that had no concept of paleontology? Were they personifying natural disasters, giving form to earthquakes and floods and volcanic fury? Or were they, as some researchers now dare to suggest, remembering something that actually existed? Something that flew, something that hunted, something that made us prey. Over the course of this investigation, we will explore 6 explanations for the dragon mystery. Some offer comfortable, rational answers. Ancient peoples found dinosaur bones, we tell ourselves, and their imaginations did the rest. Pattern recognition in the human brain, we say, creating composite creatures from snakes and crocodiles and birds of prey. But other explanations prove far more unsettling. They require us to reconsider what we think we know about history, about evolution, about the reliability of ancestral memory. They ask us to consider possibilities that science has long dismissed. They whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, the maps of the ancient world marked with the warning here, "Be dragons," were not flights of fancy, but accurate cartography. What if the stories are true? Not metaphorically true, not symbolically true, but actually, literally, historically true. What if dragons were real? What if they hunted us, and we hunted them, in a war that stretched across millennia until one species finally triumphed and the other faded into legend. What if the collective memory of humanity carries within it the trauma of looking up and seeing death descending on wings? The evidence waits. The ancient carvings and paintings and stories. The unexplained similarities. The persistent, haunting possibility that our ancestors were not mythmakers but witnesses. The sun beat down mercilessly on the Gobi Desert in what we now call Mongolia, sometime during the late Bronze Age, perhaps 3,000 years ago. A nomadic farmer, whose name history never bothered to record, walked across the barren landscape, searching for grazing land for his livestock. His foot caught on something protruding from the weathered sandstone, and he stumbled. Cursing, he knelt down to examine what had tripped him, brushing away centuries of accumulated sand and dust. What emerged from the earth stopped his breath in his chest. A skull. But not like any skull he had ever seen. It was massive, easily the size of a large dog, with a pronounced beak-like structure at the front and a distinctive frill extending backward. The bone was ancient, turned to stone, heavier than it should be. The farmer had no concept of dinosaurs, no understanding of paleontology, no framework for comprehending that he was holding a Protoceratops skull, the fossilized remains of a creature that had died more than 70 million years before his birth. What he needed was an explanation that fit his worldview, his understanding of how the universe worked. And so, in that moment, staring at this impossible amalgamation of bird and beast, the legend of the griffin was born. This scenario, reconstructed by modern paleontologists and folklorists, represents one of the most compelling theories for the origin of dragon and monster legends worldwide. The explanation is elegant, rational, almost seductively simple. Ancient peoples discovered dinosaur fossils, lacked the scientific framework to understand them, and created mythological explanations for these enormous bones erupting from the ground. It's a theory that seems to answer every question, to tie together the threads of mythology and paleontology into one neat package. But is it too convenient? Too rational? Does it explain away the mystery too easily? Or does it open a door to an even stranger truth about how our ancestors perceived their world? The evidence, at first glance, appears overwhelming. Consider China, where the connection between fossils and folklore runs deep through millennia of recorded history. Chinese apothecaries have sold what they call dragon bones for medicinal purposes since at least the 3rd century. These supposedly magical bones, ground into powder and consumed as remedies for everything from digestive ailments to spiritual malaise, were in fact dinosaur fossils, preserved in the rich fossil beds of China's interior provinces. The trade was not small or insignificant. Tons upon tons of fossilized remains passed through Chinese markets over the centuries, labeled and sold explicitly as the remnants of dragons. Western paleontologists in the 1920s were horrified to discover that countless scientifically invaluable specimens had been ground to dust and swallowed as medicine, including what might have been some of the finest examples of early mammalian fossils ever discovered. But here's where the story becomes more intriguing. The Chinese didn't simply find random bones and declare them dragons. Their descriptions of dragons, developed over thousands of years, match remarkably well with the types of dinosaur fossils found in their regions. The long serpentine Chinese dragon, often depicted without wings, bears a striking resemblance to the sauropod dinosaurs, whose remains pepper the sedimentary rocks of western China. These creatures, with their impossibly long necks, massive bodies, and whip-like tails, could easily inspire legends of giant serpents if someone stumbled upon their fossilized skeletons. The correspondence between myth and fossil is too precise to be entirely coincidental. Archaeological expeditions in the Gobi Desert during the early 20th century revealed not just dinosaur fossils, but evidence of ancient human activity in the same locations. Campsites dating back thousands of years sat within walking distance of exposed fossil beds containing Protoceratops remains. These fossils weather out naturally from the rock, exposed by wind and rain, visible to anyone passing through. The griffin legend, which originated in the same region, describes a creature with the body of a lion, the head and wings of an eagle, and a fierce protective nature. Compare this to a Protoceratops skull, The beak resembles an eagle's. The frill could suggest wings to someone unfamiliar with anatomy. And the overall impression is of something both mammalian and avian. Add to this the fact that Protoceratops nests, containing eggs and juvenile remains, are common in the area. Ancient peoples finding these nests might well have believed that griffins guarded gold, a mistranslation or metaphorical understanding of the creatures guarding their eggs, which in sunlight might have appeared golden against the desert sand. The ancient Greeks provide another compelling data point. Historians from the classical period, including Herodotus writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, documented the discovery of giant bones near ancient battlefields and in limestone caves throughout the Mediterranean. These discoveries were treated as proof of an age of heroes, a time when gods walked the earth and mortals stood 3 times the height of contemporary men. The bones of mastodons, mammoths, and other Pleistocene megafauna were interpreted as the remains of giants, cyclops, and monsters. When the Greeks found mammoth skulls with their large central nasal cavity, they saw the single eye socket of the cyclops. The connection is obvious to modern eyes, but to them, it was proof that Homer's epics described historical events, that the monsters of legend had walked the same ground they now inhabited. In 1832, a French paleontologist named Jean-Pierre Sylvestre de Saint-Pierre documented something remarkable while excavating in southern France. He found, preserved in the same stratum of limestone, both megalosaurus bones and evidence of ancient Celtic settlements. The Celtic peoples of that region had, according to later Roman accounts, worshipped dragon-like creatures they believed lived in the earth itself. Their religious sites, marked by standing stones and earthworks, clustered around areas we now know to be rich in dinosaur fossils. Coincidence, or evidence of ancient people incorporating their fossil discoveries into their spiritual worldview? The pattern repeats across continents and cultures. In North America, indigenous peoples developed rich traditions about giant bones found in the earth, attributing them to ancient races of giants or thunder beings. 19th century ethnographers recorded these stories before understanding that the same regions contained rich deposits of dinosaur and megafauna fossils. The Sioux spoke of the thunderbirds, massive creatures whose bones could be found in the Badlands of South Dakota. Those same Badlands are now recognized as one of the world's premier dinosaur fossil sites. The Untehi, giant water monsters in Lakota tradition, match the general morphology of mosasaurs and other marine reptiles, whose fossils wash out of the Pierre Shale Formation after heavy rains. Adrienne Mayer, a folklorist and historian of science, spent decades documenting these connections in her groundbreaking work on fossil legends. She traced specific mythological traditions back to specific fossil sites with detective-like precision. The gold-guarding griffins of Scythian legend appear in texts describing the exact regions where Protoceratops remains are most abundant. The giant bones that convinced Greeks of the reality of titans emerge from the same formations that yield elephant ancestor remains. The monsters of Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories cluster geographically around areas now known to contain megafauna fossils. The correlation, she argues, is too strong to ignore. Our ancestors were not stupid. They were observant, curious, and scientifically minded within the frameworks available to them. When confronted with enormous bones turned to stone, they developed rational explanations based on their existing knowledge systems. But here's where the neat explanation begins to unravel slightly, where the questions become more troubling. If dragon legends derive purely from fossil discoveries, why do dragon myths from isolated cultures share such specific details? Why do dragons across the world breathe fire, a detail no fossil could suggest? Why do they fly, when the fossils of flying reptiles are relatively rare and fragile, unlikely to be found intact by ancient peoples? Why do descriptions of dragon behavior, their intelligence, their hoarding of treasure, their interactions with humans, remain so consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other? Consider the timeline more carefully. Dragon legends appear in the archaeological and written record before we have clear evidence of systematic fossil discovery. The earliest Sumerian texts reference dragon-like creatures. The oldest Chinese oracle bones speak of dragons. But these cultures left no record of finding fossils, no descriptions of digging up giant bones, and making the intellectual leap to legendary creatures. The connection is implied, assumed by modern researchers, but never explicitly stated by the ancients themselves. And there's something else, something that makes the rational explanation feel incomplete. The emotional resonance of dragon legends goes far beyond what fossil discoveries should inspire. Dragons in mythology are not just big animals. They are numinous beings, creatures that exist at the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds. They possess wisdom, speak in human tongues, guard cosmic secrets. A Bronze Age farmer finding a strange skull might invent a large predator to explain it. But would he invent a creature that features in cosmological creation myths, that represents fundamental forces of nature, that stands as a symbol of imperial power or divine wrath? The psychological weight of dragon mythology seems disproportionate to its supposed origin. The fossil explanation is satisfying because it's materialist, scientific, provable. We can stand in museums and see protoceratops skulls and understand exactly how someone might mistake them for griffin heads. We can trace the trade routes of Chinese dragon bones and hold in our hands the very fossils that were sold as medicine. The evidence is tangible, solid, reassuring in its rationality. But that very rationality might be blinding us to deeper, stranger possibilities. Perhaps fossils reinforced existing legends rather than creating them. Perhaps our ancestors' encounters with the bones of extinct creatures confirmed what they already somehow knew, gave physical form to psychological archetypes that existed independent of paleontological discovery. The question hanging in the air, the one that makes this explanation feel incomplete despite its elegance, is simple. If dragon legends are merely misunderstood paleontology, why do they still affect us so deeply? Why does something in the human psyche respond to dragon imagery with a mixture of terror and awe that transcends intellectual understanding? We know dragons never existed. We understand that fossils are the remains of animals that died millions of years before humans evolved. Yet the image of a dragon, the idea of a dragon, carries emotional and symbolic power that the image of a Tyrannosaurus rex, equally extinct and equally impressive, somehow does not. Perhaps the paleontological explanation is both true and insufficient. True in that our ancestors absolutely did find fossils and incorporate them into their mythologies. Insufficient in that it fails to account for why those mythologies took the specific, powerful, psychologically resonant forms they did. The bones provided evidence, but something else provided the archetype. The question then becomes, what was that something else? And is the fossil explanation less an answer than a comfortable story we tell ourselves to avoid confronting a deeper mystery we're not quite ready to face? Deep in the most primitive part of your brain, coiled beneath layers of consciousness and reason, something ancient remembers. It remembers the shadow crossing overhead. It remembers the shape sliding through tall grass. It remembers teeth and claws and the sudden end of everything. This is not metaphor. This is biology. For millions upon millions of years, our ancestors were prey. Long before we built cities or forged weapons, long before we even descended from the trees, we were food. The creatures that hunted us shaped our very DNA, carving their images into our neural pathways, with such force that we carry them still. And when we try to describe the ultimate monster, the creature that haunts our deepest nightmares, we don't invent something new. We simply resurrect what evolution buried in our bones. We call it a dragon. The human brain contains what neuroscientist Paul MacLean termed the reptilian complex, a cluster of ancient structures at the base of our skull that govern survival instincts, territorial behavior, and fear responses. This portion of our brain evolved hundreds of millions of years ago, long before mammals walked the earth. It does not think. It does not reason. It simply reacts to danger with a speed that bypasses consciousness entirely. And burned into this reptilian brain is a catalog of threats that once meant certain death. 3 predators dominated this catalog for so long that they became hardwired into every human being ever born. 3 predators whose features, when combined, create the perfect description of a dragon. From above came the raptors. Eagles, hawks, and other birds of prey circled the African savanna where our primate ancestors foraged. Anthropologist Lynn Isbell at the University of California has documented how eagle predation shaped primate evolution for over 60 million years. Crowned eagles in particular specialized in hunting primates, capable of killing prey much larger than themselves. Fossilized primate skulls from millions of years ago still bear the distinctive puncture marks of raptor talons. Our ancestors lived under constant surveillance from above, never knowing when death might stoop from the sky on silent wings. The dragon remembers. It has wings. From the middle distance came the great cats. Leopards, lions, saber-toothed cats. These ambushed predators perfected the art of the hidden strike, materializing from shadows with explosive violence. Research by primatologist Carol Van Schaik found that leopards kill more primates than any other predator in modern Africa. They still do. Wild chimpanzees have been observed spending up to 20% of their waking hours watching for leopards, scanning the shadows, reading every rustling leaf. The evolutionary pressure was immense and unrelenting. Those who failed to detect the predator did not pass on their genes. Those who survived carried forward an obsessive vigilance, a paranoid certainty that something with claws was always hunting them. The dragon remembers. It has claws. And from below, sliding through grass and dropping from branches, came the serpents. Venomous snakes killed with a touch, no claws or fangs necessary, just an injection of molecular destruction that shut down the nervous system or dissolved blood cells from within. According to the snake detection theory proposed by Isbell, the very structure of primate vision evolved specifically to spot snakes. Our forward-facing eyes, our enhanced color vision, our ability to detect camouflaged patterns, all these advantages emerged from millions of years of evolutionary arms race with serpents. The primates who could see the snake survive. The primates who could not died before reproducing. Generation after generation after generation, for 60 million years, snakes shaped how we see the world. The dragon remembers. It has scales. Wings, claws, and scales. The three primary predators that hunted our ancestors for longer than our species has existed. Combined into a single entity, they form something that should not exist but feels absolutely real. A super predator. The ultimate expression of everything that ever wanted to kill us. The terror runs deeper than culture or learning. Researchers at the University of Virginia conducted studies with infants as young as 6 months old. Children who had never seen a snake or been taught to fear them. When shown images of serpentine shapes alongside pictures of flowers or other harmless objects, the infant's pupils dilated with stress responses exclusively when viewing the snake images. Their tiny bodies recognized the threat before their conscious minds had even formed. The fear is genetic. The fear is inherited. The fear is older than humanity itself. Judy Deloche at the University of Virginia expanded this research, demonstrating that children between 7 and 18 months old show immediate fear responses to realistic snake images, responding faster and more intensely than to images of spiders, which became threatening to humans much more recently in evolutionary terms. The children had no negative experiences with snakes. Many had never seen a real snake, yet something in their neurology understood the danger. The memory is burned into our genome. Similar studies with rhesus monkeys revealed that while lab-raised monkeys showed no innate fear of snakes, they learned that fear with shocking speed when shown videos of wild monkeys reacting to serpents. After a single viewing, the fear was permanent and complete. The neural pathways were waiting, preformed by evolution, requiring only the slightest trigger to activate. We are built to fear these things. We are built to never forget them. Neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux discovered that the human brain processes threat information through two pathways. The slow path runs through the conscious brain, the cortex where we think and reason. But the fast path bypasses consciousness entirely, running straight from the sensory organs to the amygdala, the fear center of the brain. This allows us to react to threats like snakes before we consciously recognize what we are seeing. You jump away from the serpent before you know it is a serpent. Your reptilian brain takes control. Your ancient programming activates. And for a brief moment, You are not a modern human being with language and technology. You are prey. This evolutionary terror may have preserved itself in the oldest continuing culture on Earth. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have maintained an oral tradition spanning tens of thousands of years, and woven throughout their stories is the rainbow serpent, a massive scaled creature associated with water, weather, and the dangerous power of the natural world. For decades, anthropologists treated these stories as pure mythology. Then they began finding the fossils. Giant monitor lizards once stalked Australia. Megalania, the largest terrestrial lizard ever to exist, grew to lengths of over 20 feet and possessed a bite delivering not just crushing force, but venom. These creatures existed in Australia until approximately 50,000 years ago, overlapping with the arrival of the first humans on the continent. The Aboriginal people who crossed into Australia during the last ice age would have encountered these dragons made flesh, and they would have told their children about them. The stories would have saved lives. Know the rainbow serpent. Fear the rainbow serpent. Watch for the rainbow serpent. And the stories persisted, generation after generation, for 50,000 years, even after the last Megalania died, even after the very bones dissolved into dust. The cultural memory remained because the survival advantage remained. Children who respected the story were more cautious around the water, more aware of dangers hidden in the landscape. The story kept them alive, and so the story itself survived. Anthropologist Julian Benoit has suggested that Australian Aboriginal rock art, depicting elongated serpentine creatures, may represent direct cultural memory of Megalania encounters. If true, these would be the oldest continuous memory of a specific animal in human history. Not metaphor, not symbol. Memory. The dragon was real, and we remember. This raises a disturbing question. If dragons exist in our DNA as evolutionary nightmares, if every culture independently developed dragon myths because we are genetically programmed to fear the combination of scales and claws and wings, then what are we really doing when we tell dragon stories? Are we creating fiction, or are we simply accessing a deeper truth? Are we inventing monsters, or are we remembering them? The consistency across cultures is staggering. Chinese dragons, European dragons, Mesoamerican feathered serpents, Middle Eastern dragon myths, African python gods. Separated by oceans and millennia, human societies that never contacted each other all imagine the same essential creature. A massive reptilian predator with features borrowed from the animals that hunted our ancestors. The details vary, but the core remains constant. Something ancient. Something scaled. Something that wants to kill us. Psychologist Carl Jung proposed the concept of the collective unconscious, an inherited psychological substrate containing archetypes shared by all humanity. He suggested that certain symbols and images appear across cultures because they reflect fundamental aspects of the human psyche shaped by our evolutionary history. The dragon, in Jung's framework, is not a shared myth but a shared memory. Not cultural transmission but biological inheritance. The dragon lives in us all because it had to. Because those who forgot died. Modern neuroscience has provided a mechanism for Jung's theory. Studies in epigenetics have demonstrated that traumatic experiences can alter gene expression in ways that pass to offspring. Mice taught to fear a specific scent produce offspring, who fear that scent despite never having been exposed to the negative conditioning. The fear transfers through DNA. The trauma becomes inherited. If this is true for mice and artificial scents, what about humans and millions of years of predation? What horrors might we carry in our chromosomes? The implications are profound and unsettling. Every time you shudder at a serpentine shape, every time you feel watched in tall grass, every time you glance nervously at the sky, you are experiencing a memory. Not your memory, not your parents' memory, a memory millions of years old, preserved through countless generations, because forgetting meant death. You are feeling what a small primate felt in an African forest, when the grass rustled and the shadow fell, and the end came suddenly with scales and claws and wings. The dragon is not what we fear might exist. The dragon is what we remember did exist, and that memory will never die. It cannot die. It is written too deeply, carved into the foundation of what we are. We are the descendants of the ones who saw the dragon and survived. Everyone else is simply gone. Their genes ended in talons and venom. Only the terrified remained. Only the paranoid produced children. And those children inherited the fear completely. This is why the dragon persists. This is why every attempt to kill the dragon in our stories feels so monumental, so heroic. We are not slaying fantasy. We are conquering the deepest, oldest part of ourselves. The part that remembers being prey. The part that knows beyond all reason and civilization that we are still prey. That we have always been prey. That somewhere in the tall grass, somewhere in the shadows, somewhere in the sky, something with scales and claws and wings is hunting us still. And in the reptilian core of your brain, beneath thought and language and everything that makes you human, something is watching for it. Something is waiting. Something remembers. It will always remember. Because the dragon is not a myth we created. The dragon is a truth we survive. And we carry it with us, coiled in our DNA, ancient and patient, and absolutely real. Deep in the limestone caves of northern Australia, a set of ochre paintings has troubled archaeologists for decades. The images are old, dating back thousands of years by every measure we have, and they show something that shouldn't be there. Alongside the expected depictions of kangaroos and emus, alongside the handprints and geometric patterns, there are creatures. Massive, scaled creatures with elongated bodies and powerful limbs, their tails sweeping across the rock face in bold strokes. They dwarf the human figures painted beside them. The Aboriginal artists who created these images lived in a world we struggle to comprehend, a world where, according to our current understanding, such creatures had already vanished into evolutionary history. But what if our timeline is wrong? What if the neat boundaries we've drawn around extinction events are more porous than we'd like to admit? The question isn't merely academic. Around the world, oral histories and physical evidence suggest something remarkable and unsettling. They suggest that the megafauna we've relegated to the distant past, the enormous beasts we know only from fossils and museum reconstructions, might have walked alongside our ancestors far more recently than we've acknowledged. More than that, they suggest some of these creatures might have survived into what we consider the modern era, their final members lingering on while human civilization took its first steps. The implications challenge everything we think we know about extinction, about human history, and about the reliability of collective memory. Consider Megalania, known scientifically as Varanus priscus. This was a monitor lizard that stretched over 20 feet from snout to tail tip, weighing perhaps 1,300 pounds. Its teeth were serrated like steak knives, and evidence suggests it was venomous. It was the largest terrestrial lizard ever to exist, an apex predator that dominated the Australian landscape. According to conventional paleontology, Megalania went extinct around 40,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia. The fossil record seems clear on this point. The bones stop appearing in datable strata after a certain point, and we assume the animal vanished. But the Aboriginal people of Australia tell a different story. For generations, long before European contact, indigenous communities across the continent spoke of the Wawi, sometimes called the Wowie or by other regional name. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. A massive lizard, far larger than any goanna alive today, with powerful jaws and a taste for large prey. Some accounts place the creature in living memory, not 40,000 years ago, but a few centuries back, perhaps even more recently in remote areas. The elders describe how these creatures would lurk near waterholes, how they moved with surprising speed despite their bulk, how their appearance would send entire camps into careful vigilance. Western scientists dismiss these accounts as myth, as the usual embellishments that accumulate around dangerous wildlife. After all, Australia has plenty of large monitor lizards even today. The parenti can reach 8 or 9 feet, impressive by any standard. Perhaps the stories simply exaggerated these known animals. But then researchers began comparing the indigenous descriptions with Megalania fossils more carefully. The anatomical details matched with uncomfortable precision. The Aboriginal accounts described the distinctive gait, the way the creature held its body off the ground, details that wouldn't be obvious from simply scaling up a modern goanna. They described behaviors, hunting patterns, and habitat preferences that aligned with what paleontologists were independently theorizing about megalania based on skeletal analysis and ecological modeling. The timeline presents the real challenge. Aboriginal people have lived in Australia for at least 65,000 years, probably longer. Their oral traditions are among the oldest continuous cultural narratives on Earth. Stories have been passed down through hundreds of generations, and research has shown these traditions can maintain remarkable accuracy over vast time spans. Aboriginal accounts accurately describe the geography of Port Phillip Bay before it flooded at the end of the last ice age, an event that occurred over 10,000 years ago. They describe megafauna like the giant short-faced kangaroo, Procoptodon, with details that match fossil evidence. If their cultural memory can preserve accurate information over 10,000 years, even 20,000 years, what does that mean for accounts of massive lizards? Could the Wowie stories represent genuine encounters, memories passed down from a time when megalania still clung to existence in remote pockets of the continent? The evidence becomes more intriguing when we look at other caves, other painting. In Arnhem Land, rock art depicts large reptilian creatures with pronounced characteristics. Some of these images appear to show extinct megafauna we know lived alongside early human. Others show creatures we haven't identified, animals that don't match any species in the current fossil record. Were these artistic inventions, mythological beings created purely from imagination? Or were they portraits, attempts to record the remarkable fauna these early artists encountered in their daily lives? The Aboriginal artists also painted thylacines, Tasmanian tigers, with clear accuracy. They painted species we can identify and verify. When they paint a 20-foot lizard, should we assume they're suddenly departing from observational art into pure fantasy? This pattern repeats across continents. In Central Africa, in the dense Congo Basin, legends persist of the Mokele-Mbembe. The name translates roughly to one who stops the flow of rivers, and descriptions paint a picture of something extraordinary. A creature with a long neck, a heavy body, a powerful tail. Something that spends much of its time in water, but comes ashore. Something large enough to overturn canoes and aggressive enough to be feared. Western explorers and cryptozoology enthusiasts have long speculated this might be a surviving sauropod dinosaur, a descendant of the great long-necked herbivores that dominated the Mesozoic. That seems far-fetched, requiring a lineage to survive 65 million years beyond the Cretaceous extinction event. But what if we're looking at the wrong animal? What if Mokele-Mbembe isn't a dinosaur at all, but rather a more recent species, something from the Cenozoic era that we haven't properly cataloged? The Congo Basin is one of the least explored regions on Earth. New species are discovered regularly, and large mammals unknown to science have been identified there within living memory. The okapi, a relative of the giraffes, wasn't confirmed by Western science until 1901, despite being well known to local population. If a creature the size of a horse could elude scientific documentation until the 20th century, what else might hide in those remote waterways? Indigenous accounts of Mokele-Mbembe include specific details. They describe its diet as herbivorous, preferring certain plants. They describe its dung, its footprints, its vocalizations. These aren't vague monster stories embellished around campfires. They're naturalistic descriptions delivered by people who live in that environment, who understand their ecology with an intimacy most outsiders can never achieve. Multiple pygmy tribes, groups separated by significant distances and without regular contact, describe essentially the same animal. That consistency suggests something real underlies the accounts. Even if we haven't determined what that something is, then there's China, with its dragons. We've become comfortable dismissing dragons as pure mythology, as symbolic creatures representing power and wisdom. But Chinese historical texts treat dragons differently than we might expect. Many accounts describe them not as supernatural beings, but as rare animals, creatures that appeared occasionally and caused great excitement when they did. The descriptions include details about their physical appearance, their behavior, their habitat. Some texts differentiate between multiple types of dragons, categorizing them the way a naturalist might classify different species. What's particularly striking is the anatomical consistency in many of these accounts. Ancient Chinese texts describe dragons with 4 legs, long serpentine bodies, and heads featuring distinctive crests or horn. They described them as dwelling in rivers and lakes, occasionally taking to land. They described them as rare, but not supernatural, animals that could be killed, whose bodies could be examined. Some accounts include details about their scales, their coloration, their diet. Could these be cultural memories of megafauna that survived longer than we realize? China was home to remarkable creatures in the not-so-distant past. Giant salamanders, some species reaching 6 feet in length, still survive there today. Crocodilians once ranged much further north in Asia than they do now. Other large reptiles inhabited the region during the Pleistocene and into the Holocene. If some of these species survived in remote areas, especially in an era before comprehensive scientific surveys, they might have inspired accounts that we now categorize as mythological. The fossil record, as comprehensive as it seems, has significant gaps. We find bones in places where conditions were right for fossilization, where sediment buried remains quickly, where geological processes preserved rather than destroyed. But vast regions and long time periods are poorly represented. A species hanging on in small numbers, in areas not conducive to fossil formation, could easily slip through our detection. Extinction itself is rarely instantaneous. It's usually a gradual process, populations shrinking, ranges contracting, until finally the last individual dies. That final chapter, the slow fade before the end, might last decades or centuries, or even millennia. During that twilight period, the creature would be incredibly rare, but still extant. Encounters would be unusual enough to seem remarkable, but they would still happen. Human memory complicates everything. Our oral traditions can preserve real information, but they also change and embellish. Details shift over generations. Metaphors become literal. Separate stories merge into composite accounts. Any researcher examining these legends must grapple with that uncertainty. Yet, completely dismissing oral history as unreliable seems like another form of bias, an assumption that only written records and physical evidence count as valid data. Indigenous peoples worldwide have provided information that later proved accurate, from the locations of archaeological sites to the behaviors of species science thought it understood. Their environmental knowledge often surpasses Western scientific understanding in specific contexts. So we're left with a puzzle. Cave paintings that seem to show extinct megafauna. Oral traditions describing creatures that match fossil species supposedly gone for tens of thousands of years. Historical accounts with unsettling specificity. Physical evidence we can't quite dismiss, but also can't quite confirm. The scientific community remains skeptical, and for good reason. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. A few paintings, and some stories, no matter how intriguing, don't constitute proof that Megalania was alive 2,000 years ago, or that unknown large reptiles inhabit Central Africa. But the evidence won't quite go away either. It lingers, troubling and persistent. It asks us to consider possibilities that violate our comfortable timelines. What if extinction isn't as final or as temporally discrete as we imagine? What if the boundary between prehistory and history is more blurred than our textbooks suggest? What if our ancestors lived in a world stranger and more dangerous than we've acknowledged? A world where the last dragons were simply the last of their kind, clinging to existence as human civilization expanded into their final refuges. The question matters for more than historical curiosity. It speaks to how we understand extinction, how we interpret evidence, and how we weigh different forms of knowledge. Right now, species are vanishing at rates that rival mass extinction events. We're watching animals slide toward oblivion in real time. Understanding how extinctions actually happen, how long the process takes, and how some species might persist against expectations could inform our conservation efforts. The megafauna question isn't just about the past. It's about recognizing that our knowledge remains incomplete, that nature still holds secrets, and that the monsters our ancestors feared might have been more real than we ever wanted to believe. The sky above Pontypridd in 1677 burned with an impossible light. Thomas Jones, a wool merchant traveling the rutted road between villages, later testified before magistrates that what he witnessed defied every natural law he understood. The creature, as he called it, descended from storm clouds with a sound like tearing canvas. its body writhing through the air in undulating curves. Fire trailed from its head. He swore, and the stench of sulfur followed its passage. 3 other travelers corroborated his account, each describing the same serpentine form, the same howling roar, the same earth that trembled as it touched down in a distant field. The authorities recorded their statements with unusual care, noting the consistency of details, the sobriety of the witnesses, the physical evidence of scorched grass found afterward. What Thomas Jones saw that day, what terrified him enough to risk ridicule by reporting it, was almost certainly a tornado, its funnel twisting through the Welsh countryside, debris and atmospheric electricity creating the illusion of scales and fire. But to him, to his companions, to anyone who heard the account, it could only be described as a flying serpent, a dragon descended from the heaven. We have forgotten how to see the sky the way our ancestors did. When you live without electric lights, without weather satellites and meteorological forecasts, the atmosphere becomes a realm of divine messages and supernatural being. Every crack of thunder carries intention. Every strange light promises revelation or doom. The people of medieval Europe, of ancient China, of Pacific Islands and African plains spent their lives under skies that performed miracles and horrors with equal frequency. They witnessed atmospheric phenomena we still barely understand, events so rare that modern science has only recently captured them on high-speed cameras and specialized instruments. Ball lightning, volcanic lightning, sprites and elves dancing in the upper atmosphere, meteor airbursts that turn night into day, St. Elmo's fire crawling along ship masts like living flame. To eyes unprepared for such wonders, to minds searching for patterns and meaning, these phenomena became dragons. Consider the historical record of fire serpents in the sky. Medieval chronicles across Europe document hundreds of sightings, described with remarkable consistency. They appear during storms. They move with serpentine motion. They glow with internal fire. They vanish as suddenly as they appear. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year 793 records fiery dragons flying through the air over Northumbria, followed shortly by famine and the Viking raid on Lindisfarne. Modern analysis suggests what those Saxon monks witnessed was likely an unusually intense meteor shower, perhaps the Perseids, with bolides bright enough to fragment and create the illusion of multiple creatures weaving through the atmosphere. But the psychological impact was profound. The monks connected the celestial serpents to earthly disaster, creating a narrative of cosmic warning that shaped how their community understood divine judgment. Ball lightning remains one of the most enigmatic atmospheric phenomena known to science. Witnesses describe glowing spheres, sometimes the size of a grapefruit, sometimes as large as a beach ball, that float through the air with apparent intelligence. They pass through windows. They roll along the ground. They emit hissing sounds. They smell of ozone and sulfur. They explode without warning or fade gradually into nothing. Scientific consensus on what causes ball lightning has only emerged in recent decades, with theories involving plasma vortexes and silicon vapor combustion still being tested and refined. For most of human history, these floating orbs of fire had no explanation beyond the supernatural. In Chinese tradition, they were dragon pearls, the source of a dragon's power. In European folklore, they were dragon eggs or dragon breath made visible. Sailors called them dragon lights and considered them omens. The consistency of these interpretations across cultures, separated by oceans, suggests something fundamental about how human minds categorize the unknown. We see agency. We see intention. We see creatures where there are only forces. The volcanic origins of dragon legends carry even more compelling evidence. Iceland, where the earth itself breathes fire and splits open to reveal molten stone, developed an intricate mythology of dragons dwelling in volcanic caves. The Icelandic dragon, the Linormur, guards treasure in the depths where normal creatures cannot survive, emerging only when the earth convulses. This description maps perfectly onto the reality of volcanic eruptions. The ground shakes. Poisonous gases emerge from fissures, killing anyone who ventures too close to the treasure of sulfur deposits. The mountain explodes with fire and smoke, creating a column that writhes into the sky, sometimes stretching for miles, sometimes collapsing and spreading across the landscape like a living thing consuming everything in its path. Pyroclastic flows move with terrifying speed, destroying villages before people can flee, leaving only shadows burned into stone. To anyone surviving such an event, the idea that a vast creature of fire dwells beneath the mountain seems not just plausible, but obvious. The Mediterranean civilizations built their dragon myths on similar volcanic foundations. The Greek Typhon, father of monsters, was imprisoned beneath Mount Etna, his struggles causing earthquakes and eruptions. The Romans adopted this story, adding details that precisely match volcanic phenomena. Typhon breathed fire that melted stone. His voice was the roar of erupting lava. His 100 serpent heads matched the multiple vents of a major stratovolcano. When Etna erupts, witnesses still describe tentacles of lava reaching down the mountainside, glowing red in darkness, moving with a kind of purposeful seeking toward human settlements. The metaphor of dragon and the reality of volcano blur into each other until they become inseparable. Indonesia, built on one of the most volcanically active zones on Earth, developed dragon legends that incorporate explicit connections to fire mountains. The islands of Java, Sumatra, and the Lesser Sundas all have stories of nagas and dragons that emerge from volcanic peaks during times of social upheaval or moral decline. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which killed tens of thousands and altered global climate, was preceded by local accounts of dragon roars echoing from the mountain for weeks. Survivors described the eruption itself in terms that combine accurate observation with mythological interpretation. The mountain split open. A dragon of fire rose into the sky. Its wings spread darkness across the world. That darkness, that volcanic winter that followed Tambora, reached Europe and North America, creating the year without a summer in 1816. Crop failures, starvation, stories told around fires in Vermont and Switzerland about the end times, about dragons that could swallow the sun. The line between natural disaster and supernatural entity disappears when the scale becomes overwhelming enough. Modern technology has captured atmospheric phenomena that challenge our sense of what is possible in nature. High-speed cameras mounted on aircraft have recorded sprites, brief flashes of red light that occur miles above thunderstorms, reaching toward space. They last milliseconds. They branch and spread like neural networks or blood vessels. When slowed down and examined frame by frame, they resemble nothing so much as vast transparent organisms pulsing with bioluminescent energy. Blue jets shoot upward from storm clouds in narrow columns, sometimes reaching 30 miles into the stratosphere. Elves, enormous expanding rings of light, spread across the upper atmosphere like ripples in water, hundreds of miles in diameter. These phenomena were only confirmed to exist in the late 20th century, despite centuries of pilots and mountaineers reporting strange lights above storms. Science dismissed these reports as hallucinations or misidentifications until cameras finally caught what human eyes had been seeing all along. Consider what this means for historical dragon sightings. Our ancestors saw the same sprites and jets and elves, but without cameras, without meteorological understanding, without any framework for categorizing these lights as atmospheric electrical discharge. They saw creatures. They saw signs. They saw dragons dancing in the upper air where no earthly being should exist, and they were not wrong to be terrified. These phenomena accompany the most violent storms, the events that destroy crops and homes and lives. The association between sky serpents and disaster was not superstition. It was pattern recognition, the same survival instinct that teaches animals to flee before earthquakes, that makes birds go silent before tornadoes form. Tornado funnels themselves present, perhaps the most dragon-like appearance of any weather phenomenon. Time-lapse footage shows them descending from storm clouds with a writhing, seeking quality, the narrow tip touching down and then widening as it gains strength. They move across landscapes with what appears to be intention, destroying some structures while leaving neighboring buildings untouched, creating the illusion of choice, of appetite. The sound of a tornado has been compared to freight trains, to jet engines, to roaring animals, a sound that vibrates in your chest and makes rational thought nearly impossible. Early warning systems did not exist for most of human history. Tornadoes appeared with little notice, often obscured by rain until the moment of impact. Survivors emerged to find landscapes transformed, familiar territory rendered alien, and the only explanation that made sense was that something alive had done this, something that flew and destroyed with purpose. The Welsh account from 1677 includes details that align perfectly with tornado behavior. The witnesses described a narrow point of contact with the ground, widening toward the sky. They reported objects lifted into the air and carried impossible distances. They mentioned the sudden stillness that followed, the eerie calm after violence. Thomas Jones specifically noted that the creature seemed to feed on the earth itself, tearing up soil and vegetation as it moved. This metaphor of consumption, of the dragon as devourer, appears in tornado accounts across cultures. The Chinese long serpent that descends from heaven to drink from lakes and rivers describes waterspouts, tornadoes over water that create visible columns of spinning moisture. Japanese legends speak of kamaitachi, invisible sickle weasels that ride on whirlwinds, cutting anyone caught in their path, an interpretation of the debris field that surrounds tornado funnels, where flying objects become deadly projectiles. We have not lost these phenomena. They occur with the same frequency as they always have, possibly with increasing intensity as climate patterns shift, but we have lost the framework for seeing them as numinous, as carriers of meaning beyond meteorological classification. When a tornado destroys a town in Oklahoma, we deploy emergency services and insurance adjusters. When ball lightning appears in someone's home, they post video to social media for scientific analysis. The sense of cosmic significance has been stripped away by explanation. Our ancestors lived in a world where these events spoke directly about divine favor or anger, about the health of the kingdom, about personal moral status. A dragon in the sky meant something about you, about your community, about the order of the world. But perhaps we have lost something more subtle and more disturbing. Perhaps there are atmospheric phenomena that occurred more frequently in ages past, that our ancestors witnessed regularly, that we no longer see because we have altered the atmospheric conditions that produced them. Historical accounts describe events with no clear, modern equivalent. Armies in the sky, witnessed by thousands, moving in formation through clouds. Crosses of light spanning horizons. Pillars of fire standing motionless for hours. Some of these can be explained as sundogs, like pillars, complex ice crystal formations. But others resist easy categorization. The dragon that allegedly flew over Rome in the year 998, witnessed by the entire city, described as hovering above St. Peter's Basilica for 3 days before flying east, fits no known atmospheric phenomenon. Mass hallucination seems unlikely at that scale. Hoax seems impossible, given the number and reliability of witnesses. We are left with accounts that suggest our ancestors saw things in the sky we no longer can, whether because atmospheric conditions have changed, or because we have trained ourselves not to see what doesn't fit our models of reality. The mystery remains alive in remote places where electric light has not yet bleached the darkness from the night sky. Villages in the Andes still report fire serpents during volcanic activity. Islands in Indonesia document dragon sightings that coincide precisely with seismic events. Tibetan monasteries maintain records of sky phenomena that Western science has only recently begun to investigate. These are not primitive people clinging to superstition. They are communities maintaining continuity with older ways of seeing, ways that recognize pattern and meaning in atmospheric events, even while understanding the physical mechanisms. The dragon and the tornado can coexist in the same mind, one a metaphor that carries cultural and spiritual weight, the other a scientific classification that enables prediction and safety. Our ancestors were not stupid. They were pattern seekers living in a world of incomplete information, doing exactly what humans do best, which is creating stories that explain experience and guide survival. The stories they created about dragons were not failures of understanding. They were successes of imagination and observation, attempts to name and therefore gain some measure of control over forces that could destroy everything they loved in moments. When we look at footage of rare atmospheric phenomena, when we see lightning that genuinely appears serpentine, when we watch volcanic plumes twist and coil like living creatures, we are not seeing what they got wrong. We are seeing exactly what they saw and understanding perhaps for the first time, why the word dragon felt not like fantasy, but like the only adequate truth. What if everything you think you know about dragons is a lie? Not a myth born from fear of the unknown, but a carefully constructed tool of control, wielded by the powerful to keep the masses in line for thousands of years. Deep in the temples of ancient Mesopotamia, priests carved images of Tiamat, the great chaos dragon, being torn apart by Marduk, god of order and civilization. But this wasn't just mythology. This was propaganda. The message was clear and deliberate. Submit to authority or face chaos. Accept the divine right of kings or watch your world dissolve into dragon-driven destruction. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic, reads less like a religious text and more like a manual for social engineering. Marduk doesn't just defeat Tiamat. He dismembers her, fashions the heavens and earth from her corpse, and establishes himself as supreme ruler. The subtext screams from every cuneiform tablet. Resistance to established power is not just rebellion. It is cosmic disorder itself. This pattern repeats with unsettling consistency across every major civilization that rose to power. In ancient China, emperors didn't just claim descent from dragons. They monopolized dragon imagery entirely, making it illegal for commoners to wear dragon symbols or display them in their homes. The penalty for violating these laws was often death. This wasn't about pride or vanity. This was about manufacturing divinity, creating an unbridgeable gap between rulers and rule. The dragon, that supreme symbol of power and natural force, belonged exclusively to those who sat on thrones. Every time a peasant looked upon dragon iconography in a temple or palace, the message reinforced itself. The emperor is not like you. The emperor is descended from beings of such power that they command storms, rivers, and the very fertility of the earth itself. But the control went deeper than symbols. Archaeological evidence from sites across China reveals something far more sinister. Dragon temples often contain evidence of ritualistic practices that can only be described as human sacrifice. At the Shimao site in Shaanxi province, dating to approximately 2300 BCE, researchers discovered pits filled with human skulls, many showing signs of violent death. These skulls were arranged in patterns surrounding carved jade dragons. The implication is inescapable. The dragon cult demanded blood, and those in power were more than willing to provide it, using religious terror to eliminate dissidents and maintain iron control over their subjects. The Christian Church perfected this technique centuries later, transforming the dragon from a symbol of imperial divinity into the ultimate representation of paganism and evil itself. Saint George and the Dragon, Saint Margaret and the Dragon, Saint Michael and the Dragon. These weren't random folk tales that emerged organically. These were carefully crafted narratives designed to accomplish a specific goal: the complete and total psychological destruction of pre-Christian belief systems. Consider the story of Saint George more carefully. A Roman soldier encounters a town terrorized by a dragon that demands human sacrifice. The king's daughter is about to be fed to the beast when George arrives, defeats the dragon, and converts the entire town to Christianity. On the surface, it's a simple tale of good versus evil, but examine what the dragon represents in this context. The dragon is paganism itself, the old gods, the old ways. The sacrifices to that dragon? Those were the rituals and practices of indigenous European religions. And George, the Christian soldier, doesn't just defeat the dragon. He forces conversion at sword point. Accept Christ or face the monster. The narrative does the work that 1,000 sermons could never accomplish. It makes conversion seem not like capitulation to a foreign god, but like salvation from literal monsters. Churches across Europe were deliberately built on sites previously considered sacred to dragon cults. In Worms, Germany, the Siegfried legend tells of the dragon Fafnir slain at a spring that later became the site of a Christian cathedral. In Britain, dragon hills, dragon mounds, and dragon caves dot the landscape, almost all of them later claimed by Christian structures. This wasn't coincidence. This was conquest, physical and psychological. The church was erasing the dragon, Yes, but more importantly, it was erasing everything the dragon had represented to the people who lived there before. The archaeology tells a story that official histories tried to bury. At Sutton Hoo in England, excavations revealed elaborate dragon imagery in a burial mound dating to the early 7th century, right at the cusp of Christian conversion. The dragon motifs show clear evidence of ritualistic significance, with patterns suggesting astronomical alignments and seasonal markers. This wasn't decoration. This was a sophisticated belief system tied to agricultural cycles, celestial events, and community identity. Within a generation, that entire symbolic language was being systematically destroyed and replaced with narratives of dragon-slaying saints. But here's where the conspiracy deepens into something far more disturbing. The dragon motifs found at sites like Sutton Hoo bear striking similarities to dragon imagery from cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. Mesopotamian dragons, Chinese dragons, Norse dragons, Mesoamerican feathered serpents. The iconographic patterns are too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. We're told these similarities arose from parallel evolution of human psychology, that all cultures independently created dragon myths from misidentified fossils or exaggerated reptiles. But what if that's exactly what we're meant to believe? What if the consistency points to something else entirely? A lost global civilization that possessed advanced knowledge and used dragon symbolism as a universal language of power. Evidence for this possibility exists in places the mainstream narrative prefers to ignore. The Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey, dated to approximately 9600 BCE, features elaborate stone pillars carved with serpent and dragon-like creatures millennia before any civilization was supposed to exist in that region. The level of astronomical knowledge embedded in the site's layout suggests a sophistication that shouldn't have existed. And at its center, dragon imagery used in what appears to be ritual contexts. Were the builders of Göbekli Tepe part of a knowledge network that spanned the ancient world? Were they the original architects of the dragon control system? Consider the placement of so-called dragon sites across the globe. They align with geological features in ways that suggest deliberate planning. Dragon springs, dragon caves, dragon mountains. They appear at key locations along ley lines, ancient trade routes, and astronomical sightlines. In China, dragon temples mark nodes in what geomancers call dragon vines, energy lines running through the earth. Dismiss feng shui as superstition if you like, but these sites often correspond with geological fault lines, underground water sources, and mineral deposits. Someone in deep antiquity had knowledge of the Earth's structure and used dragon symbolism to mark and control access to crucial resources. The ritual practices at these sites reveal a pattern of social control so sophisticated it seems almost modern. At the Dragon Bone Hill near Beijing, excavations revealed not just Peking man fossils, but evidence of much later ritual activities involving fire ceremonies and what appeared to be initiation rites. Young members of the community would be brought to the cave, surrounded by dragon imagery, subjected to sensory experiences involving smoke, darkness, and probably hallucinogenic compounds, and emerge having been psychologically bonded to the power structure through manufactured spiritual experience. This wasn't religion as we understand it. This was behavioral programming using the dragon as the central trauma and awe-inducing symbol. The priest classes who controlled these sites held power that rivaled and often exceeded that of kings. They possessed knowledge that seemed magical to common people. Knowledge of astronomy, medicine, agriculture, metallurgy. And they wrapped that knowledge in dragon symbolism, making it sacred, forbidden, accessible only to the initiated. In Mesopotamia, the priests of Marduk controlled the calendar, predicted floods, managed grain storage, and advised kings on warfare. Their authority came not from military might, but from their supposed ability to communicate with and control the cosmic dragon forces. Challenge a king and you might be executed. Challenge the dragon priests, and you were challenging reality itself. This system of control through dragon mythology persisted because it worked on multiple psychological levels simultaneously. Dragons embodied chaos and order, destruction and creation, the terrifying unknown, and the promise of transcendent power. They were the perfect tool for social engineering. Tell people that dragons exist in the wild chaos beyond civilization's borders, and they stay within those borders. Tell them only the emperor carries dragon blood, and they accept hierarchy as natural law. Tell them the dragon is paganism incarnate, and they convert to Christianity. Tell them dragon sites are sacred and they'll bring offerings and submit to priestly authority for generations. But someone didn't want this system to continue forever. The knowledge network that created and maintained dragon mythology across cultures appears to have been deliberately dismantled around the turn of the first millennium. Dragon-slaying narratives multiply precisely when centralized power structures, Christian and otherwise, are consolidating control. The old dragon cults, with their distributed authority and mysterious knowledge, represented a threat to newer, more rigid hierarchies. So they were destroyed, but cleverly. The dragons weren't eliminated from belief. They were reframed, transformed from symbols of natural power accessible through ritual into monsters that could only be defeated by sanctioned heroes. Saints, emperors, gods of order. What knowledge was lost in that transition? The dragon sites themselves offer tantalizing hints. Many show evidence of sophisticated understanding of geology, astronomy, and even what we might call psychology. The priests who controlled these sites knew something about how to modify human behavior, how to create states of consciousness that bonded people to symbols and authority structures. That knowledge didn't disappear. It was monopolized, hidden, passed down through ever-narrowing channels of initiates who served the emerging power structures of church and state. Today, we're told dragons never existed except in imagination. But that misses the point entirely. Dragons were never about literal monsters. They were always about power, about control, about keeping certain knowledge accessible only to certain people. The conspiracy isn't that dragons were real, and we're hiding that fact. The conspiracy is that dragon mythology was a deliberate, sophisticated system of social control that worked for thousands of years across every major civilization, and we've been conditioned to dismiss it as primitive superstition precisely so we don't recognize similar systems operating in our own time. The dragon sites remain, scattered across the planet, most of them unexcavated, their secrets still buried. And perhaps that's exactly how those in power prefer it. Because if we truly understood how the dragon myth was engineered and deployed, we might start asking what modern myths are being used the same way. What symbols and narratives today serve the same function that dragon-slaying saints and divine dragon emperors served yesterday? The answer to that question is more terrifying than any dragon ever was. Because unlike mythical monsters, the systems of control operating now are absolutely real. There are places in the human mind that most of us never visit. Locked chambers of consciousness that our ancestors knew well, but that modern civilization has taught us to ignore. What they found in those places, what they encountered in realms accessed through ancient practices and sacred substances, tells a story so consistent and so disturbing that it challenges everything we believe about the nature of reality itself. And at the center of these encounters, witnessed across continents and centuries by people who could never have communicated with one another, appears the same figure again and again. The serpent. The dragon. The scaled intelligence that seems to be waiting on the other side. In the upper Amazon, where the Rio Negro meets tributaries so remote they appear on no tourist map, indigenous shamans have conducted the same ceremony for longer than anyone can remember. They brew a thick, bitter drink from the ayahuasca vine and the leaves of the chacruna plant, a combination that produces one of the most powerful psychedelic experiences known to humanity. The shamans call ayahuasca the vine of the dead, or sometimes the rope to the spirit world. What makes their accounts remarkable is not simply that they report visions, but that these visions follow patterns so specific, so detailed, and so consistent that they demand explanation. Western researchers who have participated in these ceremonies, people with no background in indigenous mythology, and often with explicit skepticism about mystical experiences, report strikingly similar encounters. Within 30 to 40 minutes of drinking the brew, as the DMT in the chacruna leaves crosses the blood-brain barrier, participants describe a sensation of leaving their bodies, of being pulled or propelled into another space entirely. And there, in that space, they meet beings. Not abstract concepts or symbolic representations, but entities that seemed to possess independent intelligence, intention, and most disturbing of all, recognition of the human visitors. Anthropologist Jeremy Narby spent years living with the Ashaninka people of the Peruvian Amazon, and what he discovered there shook the foundations of his academic training. The shamans told him consistently that their knowledge of medicinal plants, their understanding of which combinations could heal and which could kill, did not come through trial and error over generations. It came from the plants themselves, or rather from the entities they encountered, while under the influence of ayahuasca. These entities, they said, appeared as enormous serpents, scaled and ancient, with eyes that held intelligence beyond human comprehension. The serpents, according to the shamans, were teachers. They showed the indigenous people which plants to combine, how to prepare them, which songs to sing during the process. The pharmacological knowledge of these cultures, which modern science has confirmed as remarkably sophisticated, allegedly came from encounters with reptilian beings in altered states of consciousness. Narby documented something even more unsettling. When Western participants in ayahuasca ceremonies reported their visions to him, people who had never been told the indigenous mythology, who had no framework for what they might experience, they described the same beings: massive serpents, reptilian entities, scaled forms that moved with liquid grace through spaces that seemed more real than ordinary reality. Some described these beings as dragons, others as cosmic serpents, still others as reptilian humanoids. But the consistency of the reports, the specific details about scales, about eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you, about a sense of vast age and intelligence, appeared again and again. Dr. Rick Strassman conducted the first legal research into DMT, the same molecule present in ayahuasca, at the University of New Mexico in the early 1990s. He administered pure synthetic DMT to 60 volunteers in a clinical setting, carefully controlling dosage and environment. What he expected were reports of abstract patterns, perhaps some emotional insights, the kind of experiences associated with other psychedelics. What he got instead disturbed him so deeply that it changed the direction of his career and his understanding of consciousness itself. More than half of his volunteers reported encounters with entities, not vague presences or symbolic figures, but beings that the participants described as absolutely real, as independently existing, as possessing their own agenda and awareness. Many of these beings were described in reptilian terms. Participants used words like scaled, serpentine, lizard-like, dragon. Some reported that these entities seemed to be waiting for them, that they expressed something like surprise or pleasure that a human had managed to visit their realm. Others felt that these beings were studying them, examining them with an intelligence that felt ancient and utterly alien. Several participants, when they returned from the experience, were adamant that what they had encountered was not a hallucination, not a product of their own mind, but actual contact with an independent form of consciousness. Strassman's volunteers had no connection to shamanic traditions. They were students, professionals, people from modern American culture with no framework for these experiences. Yet, their reports paralleled those of indigenous ayahuasca users with remarkable precision. The same entities, the same sense of entering another dimension, the same reptilian characteristics appearing in description after description. Now we must turn to something even more ancient, and perhaps more disturbing. Graham Hancock, investigating the origins of religious and mystical experience, has spent decades examining cave art from the Upper Paleolithic period. Images created between 10,000 and 40,000 years ago by the first humans we recognize as fully modern. Many of these images were created deep in caves, in chambers that required dangerous journeys through narrow passages, in spaces that show no evidence of habitation. Why would our ancestors venture so far into the darkness to create these images? Hancock proposes that these were not living spaces but ritual spaces, locations where early humans went specifically to enter altered states of consciousness. Evidence from the caves suggests the use of various methods to achieve these states. Some chambers show signs of rhythmic drumming that would continue for hours, a technique known to induce trance states. Others show possible evidence of psychoactive plants that grew in the regions surrounding the caves. The humans who created this art were, according to this theory, deliberately altering their consciousness, seeking visions, attempting to contact something beyond ordinary reality. And what did they paint on those cave walls? Alongside the familiar images of bison and horses, alongside the handprints and geometric patterns, appears another figure. Serpents. Not simple snake drawings, but elaborate, powerful serpent forms, often impossibly large, sometimes with features that suggest intelligence, intention, divinity. Some of these serpent images are depicted in ways that suggest they were teachers, guides, or sources of knowledge. In several caves, human figures are shown in postures that suggest communication or reception of information from these serpent entities. Similar patterns appear in rock art from Australia, from southern Africa, from the Americas, cultures separated by oceans and millennia, with no possibility of contact, created images showing humans interacting with powerful serpent beings during what appeared to be ritual or visionary states. The consistency is archaeological fact. The interpretation is where we enter disturbing territory. Hancock asks a question that most academics refuse to consider. What if these images are not symbolic? What if they are reportage? What if our ancestors were documenting actual encounters, experiences as real to them as anything in waking life, with entities that appeared consistently across cultures because these entities actually exist in some realm accessible through altered consciousness? Consider the specificity of reports across different substances and different cultures. The Huichol people of Mexico use peyote, a cactus containing mescaline, in their sacred ceremonies. Their accounts include encounters with beings they describe as ancient reptilian spirits, teachers who showed them sacred knowledge. The Mazatec people use psilocybin mushrooms and report visions of serpent entities who speak in languages that seem older than human speech. In West Africa, Iboga ceremonies produce encounters with what practitioners describe as reptilian ancestors or primal spirits with scaled forms and vast knowledge. Different plants, different chemical compounds, different neurological pathways, yet the same entities appearing again and again. Modern users of DMT, consuming the substance in laboratory settings or in urban environments far removed from any shamanic tradition, report these encounters without any cultural prime. Trip reports logged anonymously on internet forums show the same patterns. I met the reptilian intelligence. There were dragon beings made of light, and they looked at me like they'd been waiting. I saw serpent entities, and they showed me things about the nature of reality that I can't put into words. The consistency is not explainable by cultural transmission because many of these people had no exposure to shamanic mythology before their experiences. The disturbing question becomes unavoidable. What if consciousness, as we understand it, is not generated by the brain but filtered through it? What if the brain acts as a reducing valve, in the words of philosopher Aldous Huxley, screening out a vast ocean of perception to allow us to function in ordinary reality? What if these substances temporarily disable that filter, allowing perception of realms that exist parallel to our own? And what if, in those realms, there actually are intelligences, entities, beings that have their own existence independent of human imagination? This theory suggests that dragons, serpent gods, reptilian entities are not myths created by our ancestors, but reports of actual contact with something that exists in dimensions we can no longer easily access. Modern consciousness, shaped by literal thinking, by technology, by cultures that dismiss altered states as mere hallucination, has lost the ability or the willingness to visit these realms. But they remain, according to this explanation, populated by the same entities that shamans and cave painters encountered. The serpent beings wait in spaces that our ancestors knew intimately, but that we have convinced ourselves do not exist. The implications create a kind of philosophical vertigo. If these encounters are real in any meaningful sense, then reality is far stranger and far more populated than mainstream science acknowledges. We are not alone, but our companions exist in dimensions that require specific neurological states to perceive. They are intelligent. They are ancient beyond human comprehension. And they take reptilian forms with such consistency that the archetype of the dragon, the cosmic serpent, the scaled teacher, might not be an archetype at all, but a description. Those who have experienced these encounters often return, changed in ways that simple hallucination does not explain. They report insights into the nature of consciousness, into human history, into ecological relationships that they could not have known through ordinary means. Some shamans return with specific information about plant medicine that later proves pharmacologically accurate. Others bring back knowledge of astronomical relationships that they had no means to calculate. The serpent entities, if that is what they are, seem to teach, but they also observe. Many experiencers report the unsettling sensation that these beings were studying them as much as they were studying the beings. That contact goes both ways. That when we enter these realms, we become visible to intelligences that have their own purposes, their own vast and unknowable agendas. The dragons, in this telling, are not creatures of myth, but inhabitants of adjacent reality, aware of us, perhaps having been aware of us for all of human history, accessible to those who know or accidentally discover how to shift consciousness into the frequencies where they can be perceived. The modern world has dismissed these experiences as neurological misfires, as the brain's response to chemical disruption, as meaningless static produced by altered chemistry. But this dismissal requires us to ignore the stunning consistency of reports across cultures, substances, and centuries. It requires us to believe that human neurology, when disrupted in specific ways, always generates the same hallucination, always produces encounters with reptilian intelligences, always creates the sensation of visiting another dimension populated by ancient teachers. It requires us to believe that our ancestors worldwide created mythology around these experiences without those experiences having any referent in external reality. Or we can consider the alternative, that there are realms we have forgotten how to access, that consciousness extends far beyond the boundaries of skull and skin, that the universe contains forms of intelligence that do not depend on biology as we understand it, and that among these intelligences, serpentine and vast, patient and watchful, are beings that know us far better than we know them, beings that have watched human history unfold, beings that perhaps shaped our evolution in ways we have only dimly remembered through myth and symbol, and the persistent, worldwide archetype of the dragon. The unease this possibility creates runs deeper than ordinary fear. It suggests that we are not at the top of any hierarchy of consciousness, that we may in fact be observed, studied, perhaps even influenced by forms of awareness that make us look like children fumbling in darkness. It suggests that the shamans were right, that the cave painters were recording truth, that thousands of years of human testimony about encounters with serpent beings deserves to be taken seriously, not as metaphor, but as experience. What waits in the dimensions our ancestors could access but we have abandoned? What looks back when consciousness ventures beyond ordinary boundaries? And why, across every human culture that has dared to look, does it have scales? Weighing? We've journeyed through 6 compelling explanations for why dragons appear in every corner of our world. We've examined dinosaur fossils that could have sparked ancient imaginations, psychological archetypes buried deep in the human mind, and the convergence of predator fears that haunted our ancestors. We've seen how whales and crocodiles might have inspired maritime legends, how fire and volcanic fury could birth tales of flame-breathing beasts, and how the venom-spitting cobra became something far more terrifying in the reteller. Each theory offers a tantalizing glimpse of possibility, a rational framework to contain the inexplicable. Yet here, at the end of our investigation, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. None of these explanations, no matter how elegant or scientifically grounded, fully closes the book on dragon. Each theory illuminates part of the puzzle while casting new shadows elsewhere. The fossil explanation cannot account for the remarkable consistency of dragon descriptions across cultures, separated by vast oceans and millennia. D. The psychological theory struggles to explain why the archetype manifests with such specific physical details rather than abstract symbolism. The predator convergence hypothesis falters when we consider dragons described in cultures without exposure to the necessary combination of dangerous animals. But perhaps most troubling of all are the accounts that refuse to fade into the comfortable past, the modern sightings that defy our carefully constructed rational frameworks. In 2024, a mountaineering expedition in the Himalayas captured footage that continues to perplex analysts. The grainy video shows something massive moving through clouds at an altitude where no known bird species can sustain flight. The expedition leader described a serpentine form with what appeared to be wings, its movement unlike any aircraft or known biological flight pattern. Skeptics point to atmospheric anomalies, to tricks of light at extreme altitude, yet the footage has withstood 2 decades of digital analysis without definitive debunking. Then there are the Wyoming cave paintings discovered by spelunkers in 2012, hidden in a network of caves previously unknown to modern surveys. Carbon dating places these images firmly in the 1800s, created by indigenous peoples who left detailed depictions of creatures that match classical dragon descriptions with unsettling precision. What makes these paintings particularly haunting is their context. They're not mythological murals or spiritual symbols, but appear to be documentary in nature, surrounded by accurate depictions of bison, elk, and local geography. The dragons are rendered with the same observational detail, suggesting the artists considered them part of the natural world they inhabited. The Congo Basin continues to produce eyewitness accounts that traditional zoology cannot easily dismiss. Local communities in remote regions consistently describe a creature they call Mokuliel Mbembe, a swamp-dwelling beast with a long neck, massive body, and aggressive territorial behavior. While some researchers suggest surviving sauropods, the descriptions often include details that deviate from known dinosaur morphology, features that align more closely with dragon mythology, from cultures that should have no connection to Central African oral traditions. Multiple expeditions have returned with unexplained sonar readings from deep swamp waters, thermal signatures that don't match known wildlife, and physical evidence in the form of unusual tracks and disturbed vegetation that suggests something very large and very much alive. Consider the vastness of what we do not know. 80% of our oceans remain unexplored, depths where pressure and darkness create alien environments we've barely glimpsed. The Mariana Trench alone could hide ecosystems entirely unknown to science. We discover new species every week, creatures that rewrite our understanding of biological possibility. Giant squid were dismissed as sailors' fantasy until a specimen washed ashore in 1873. Coelacanths were extinct for 65 million years until a fisherman caught one in 1938. The okapi, the soala, the megamouth shark, all emerged from legend into verified reality within living memory. Our planet's cave systems represent an entire frontier of unexplored territory. The Sun Dome Cave in Vietnam, discovered only in 1991, is large enough to house a 40-story skyscraper. We're still mapping its chambers. Krubera Cave in Georgia reaches depths of over 2,000 meters, its lowest passages explored for the first time this century. What else waits in subterranean networks we haven't yet found? What could survive in these lightless ecosystems, evolving in isolation for millennia? The persistence of dragon legends across time presents its own mystery. These aren't fading folk tales kept alive by academic interest. They're living beliefs, continuously renewed by people who claim direct experience. From Scottish highlands to Chinese mountains, from Indonesian islands to Patagonian wilderness, the reports continue. Modern witnesses, with no incentive to fabricate, no exposure to each other's accounts, describe remarkably similar creatures. They risk ridicule and disbelief to report what they've seen. Perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along. We've focused on explaining why cultures created dragon myths, searching for the cognitive tricks and environmental factors that spark these legends. But what if the question isn't why every culture imagined dragons? What if the question is whether something in the deep past ensured that every culture remembered them? What if these stories aren't creative inventions but inherited memories, passed down through countless generations, warning us of something our ancestors encountered when the world was younger and wilder? The possibility haunts the edges of rational thought. Could there have been a time when something existed that matched these descriptions? Could pockets of that population have persisted into historical times, appearing rarely enough to become legendary, but consistently enough to keep the memory alive? The fossil record is notoriously incomplete. Soft tissues rarely fossilize, and we've explored only a fraction of potential paleontological sites. Entire ecosystems leave barely a trace. The conditions required for fossilization are so specific that absence of evidence cannot be considered evidence of absence. We stand at the boundary between the known and unknown, that uncomfortable space where certainty dissolves. Science has given us tools to explore reality with unprecedented precision, yet the universe continues to surprise us. Quantum mechanics reveals behavior that defies intuition. Consciousness remains fundamentally unexplained. We discover new laws of physics by observing phenomena that shouldn't exist according to our previous understanding. Perhaps dragons occupy a similar space, a phenomenon that doesn't fit our current frameworks, not because it's impossible, but because our frameworks are incomplete. The eternal watch continues. Somewhere tonight, someone will glimpse something moving against the stars, too large and too strange to be easily explained. Someone will explore an unmapped cave system and find claw marks on ancient stone. Someone will hear a sound in the wilderness that matches no known animal. These experiences will be dismissed, rationalized, forgotten by all but those who lived them. But the reports will continue, adding to centuries of accumulated testimony that refuses to be fully silenced. Perhaps we stopped seeing dragons not because they vanished, but because we stopped looking up. We've turned our gaze inward and downward, focused on the small screens in our hands and the immediate concerns of modern life. We've paved over the wild places, illuminated the darkness, convinced ourselves that mystery is something to be eliminated rather than respected. But the world remains vast, and the unknown still watches from places we haven't reached. The question of dragons remains open, waiting in the shadows of unexplored caves, in the depths of uncharted seas, in the vast silence of mountains too remote for casual visitors, waiting for us to look up once more and wonder what's really out there, beyond the comfortable boundaries of what we think we know. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.